The Rebbe began the Farbrengen this afternoon that today's Shabbos is referred to as Shabbos Chazoin, simply because of the Haftarah. That is the Haftarah which we say today, beginning with the words Chazoin Yeshayahu, the vision of Yeshayahu Hanavi. However, there's an interpretation from Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Barditchev, who is known for his outstanding Avas Yisrael, who he interpreted Chazoin meaning vision, but differently. Meaning that the Rebishter here on this Shabbos shows every Yid the third Beis HaMikdash. Every Yid has an opportunity on this Shabbos to have a vision into the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi. And as the Rebbe explained today, when a Yid sees the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi and sees how great it is, how greater it is than the first and second Beis HaMikdash, this brings him to a realization that being that everything is dependent on our action and on our deeds, how we act now, this will hasten the coming of Mashiach. So Mamela, when the Yid sees the greatness of the third Beis HaMikdash, this will bring to it that his entire attitude will change to such an extent that we will take it, be zeicha to have the third Beis HaMikdash as soon as possible. And as the Rebbe went on to explain, that though we find something very outstanding in the first Beis HaMikdash, we look back into Tanakh, we see that when Shlomo HaMelech celebrated the dedication of the first Beis HaMikdash, it came out to be on Yom Kippur. And then we see that it was such a great celebration that they did away with Yom Kippur. They didn't fast on that Yom Kippur, though we know how great the fast of Yom Kippur is. So they didn't fast then, but they were all rejoicing and celebrating the Chanukas of the Beis HaMikdash, the dedication of the Beis HaMikdash. And here we say that the third Beis HaMikdash will be yet greater than this. How great the first Beis HaMikdash was, that the Beis HaMikdash was so powerful, that when the Beis HaMikdash was dedicated, it did away with Yom Kippur, and Yom Kippur is so great that Chassidus explains, Yom Kippurim, the greatness of Purim. The Yontif of Purim is very great. And we say that Yom Kippur is Kippurim. It's as like Purim, but not exactly like Purim. Showing us that Purim is really greater. Why? Because as it's explained in Chassidus, the whole idea of Purim is that from when Haman came out with his plan, which he wanted to Chas v'Shalom do on Yidden, until the Rebishter really performed the Neis Purim, Yidden was standing in a tnuah, in a mood of tshuva for a period of 11 months. And this period, standing constantly in a level of tshuva, elevated them to a tremendous extent. So we say that the yontif of Yom Kippur is Kippurim. It's like Purim. In other words, Purim is greater, but Yom Kippur has an equivalence to Purim. But on the other hand, we know how great Yom Kippur is. So we say that when the Beis HaMikdash was dedicated, they did away with the fast of Yom Kippur. But when we're talking about the third Beis HaMikdash, it is even yet greater than this inyan. So here we can understand what it means, the Shabbos Chazoin, the Shabbos when we get a vision into this Beis HaMikdash. And as the Rebbe added on, like we see right away in the words from the Pasuk, it comes Chazoin Yeshayahu. Who is the vision from Yeshayahu Hanavi? And the Frierdiker Rebbe explains at length that Yeshayahu was a Navi that we see in the name itself, we see the greatness of the Navi. What does Yeshayahu? Comes from the word Yeshua, help. So in other words, the whole motive, the whole idea of Yeshayahu Hanavi was that he brought to the Yidden assistance and help. It's explained. B'negei Yirmiyah and Yeshayahu, the difference. Yirmiyah has within his name the word mar, bitterness, as opposed to Yeshayahu has within his name the idea of Yeshua, of assistance. So this is the vision that stems from Yeshayahu Hanavi, which Yidden are bekoyach today, and as the Rebbe went on to explain, though naturally not everybody is up to this level of saying that he has a vision into the third Beis HaMikdash on this Shabbos, but as it is explained in Chassidus, B'negei what Chazal say, Af al gav di'ihu loy chazeh mazlayu chazeh. There are many times that a person himself does not feel it. However, everyone has a mazel within him. This inner mazel within the person definitely feels this great vision which can be seen on Shabbos Chazoin. that's where it's brought, by the Neil. That's where the expression is, as Afal Gav Di'u Loi Chazim as La Yu Chazi. And then the Rebbe added on, that in order that we should really be able to have the realization and the greatness of the Beis HaMikdash, one of the best ways is by bringing into practicality the idea which the Rebbe keeps on stressing, Tzion b'mishpat tipada, v'shaveho b'tzedakah, that Tzion, Klal Yisrael, will be redeemed out of Golus through mishpat. What do we mean by mishpat? Mishpat means Torah. By learning Torah, and particularly what type of Torah? Torah that has a shaykhus to Beis HaMikdash. And this is what the Rebbe keeps on demanding from us, that these days are very suitable that we should learn all in Yonim that have a shaykhus to Beis HaMikdash. Learn in the Navi Yecheskel, in the Rambam Hilchos Beis HaPrira, as far as Gemara, to learn Masechta Midas. And by learning these inyanim, this will give us an insight into the greatness of the Beis HaMikdash. The Rebbe added on, just like a person, at times he cannot see a certain object, or he does not see it clear. However, this is the whole idea of glasses, that when one puts on eyeglasses, this assists him, that something that without the eyeglasses he wouldn't be able to see it, but it's through the eyeglasses that he can see it. The very same, through learning these inyanim in Torah that have a shaykhus with Beis HaPrira, with Beis HaMikdash, this will bring to it that we will be able to zeicha that this taich of the Barditcheva should be fulfilled, that we should have a vision, a clear sight into the third Beis HaMikdash. And as well, another inyan which the Rebbe demands very strongly that has to be utilized in these days is the other half of the pasuk, V'shaveha b'tzedakah, that it's very appropriate to give special tzedakah during the 9 days. And this fulfills the idea of Tzion b'mishpat tipada v'shaveha b'tzedakah. This, the Rebbe continues, applies b'negei Shabbos Chazayin, regardless whatever the day in the month Shabbos Chazayin will fall out. Now naturally Shabbos Chazayin always has to be before Tisha B'Av. Always we read on Shabbos Chazayin Pashas Devarim. However, it could be different days in the month of Av, to such an extent that Shabbos Chazayin could even be Erev Tisha B'Av as well. However, today's Kviyas is that Shabbos Chazayin falls out to be on 4 days in the month of Av. And it is already Shabbos Chazayin in the afternoon. And as we know that the afternoon of the Shabbos already has a shaykhus to the next day. And this so strong that even b'negei halacha it is so. For example, if Rosh Chodesh should fall out on a Sunday, by Shabbos, by Mincha, we already don't say Tzidkas Chatzedek. So we see that the Shabbos has a shaykhus to the day that comes after Shabbos. What is so special the following day, that this year after Shabbos, 5 days in the month of Av, it is the day of the Yortzeit of the Arizal. And the Rebbe explained, it is impossible that Shabbos should fall out the 5th day of Av. That we never have. Why? Because if Shabbos is Daled Av like this year, Tisha B'Av is when? On a Thursday. However, if Shabbos would be 5 days in Av, then Tisha B'Av would have to fall out when? On a Wednesday. It is impossible for Tisha B'Av to fall out on a Wednesday. Why? Because Tisha B'Av is always the same day as the first day of Pesach. The same date that the 15th of Nisan falls out, the 9th of Av falls out. And we have a klal, we have a rule, Loi Bidu Pesach. Pesach can never fall, the first day of Pesach can never fall out, neither on a Monday, a Wednesday, or a Friday. So Mamela Tisha B'Av again can also not fall out to be on a Wednesday. So the closest we could have a Shabbos that should have a shaykhus to hay off to the Yotzeit of the Arizal is like it is this year. Shabbos should be 4 days in Av, and Shabbos afternoon we're already about to enter the day of the Yotzeit of the Arizal, which is 5 days in the month of Av. And while talking about this Indian, the Rebbe explained what is Taka the Shaykhis between the Yontif of Pesach and Tisha B'Av. I mean, it's a klal, but we must say that there's some sort of connection between the fact that the same day Pesach falls out to be, the same day Tisha B'Av falls out. Rabbi explained, the idea of Pesach is Geula, redemption. That's the whole idea what Pesach stands for, Zman Chei Huseinu. Tisha B'Av will also be turned into a tremendous Yontif, to a tremendous Yom HaGeula. Memela, this is the strong shaykhus, the strong relation between Tisha B'Av and Pesach, just like Pesach stands for an union of Geula, Tisha B'Av will ultimately be turned into a Yontif of Geula as well. And the Arizal is very noted for demanding the spreading of Chasidus, of Pnimiyus HaTorah, as the Arizal writes, that in nowadays, it's mitzvah legaloi soisa chochma, it's a mitzvah to spread this part of Torah, the part of Torah of Pnimiyus HaTorah, which this brings about a very close shaychus between the Arizal and the general idea of Chasidus and Afosas HaMayon is spreading the worlds of Chasidus. And the Rebbe said that usually when we refer to the Arizal, we refer to him either by the title of Arizal, Ari Zechayna Levracha, or there are many that refer to him by another title, Ari HaChai. In other words, that his soul, his spirit is always constantly living. And the idea of Ari, the Rebbe says, this is the opening of Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch begins with the words that a person has to be Yisgaber Ka'ari, one has to strengthen himself as a lion. And this coincides very strongly with the Arizal. Another very strong shaykhis is the mazel of the month of Elul. Every month has a special mazel. The mazel of the month, of the month of Av is Ari. And tied in with a pasuk, Allah Ari misufchay. That Ari, the lion, comes out of his hiding place. So this spoke about the greatness of the Arizal, and this day, today's Shabbos Chazayin, is of particular significance because it comes as close as a Shabbos Chazayin can come to the Hilula of the Arizal. Later in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe explained the Rashi, as well as an Inyan in Pirkei Avos, and as the Rebbe added on, when it comes during the 3 weeks, we also learn an Inyan in the Rambam of Hilchas Beis HaPrira, and also in the commentary of his father on the Zohar. B'negei the Rambam, in Hilchas Beis HaPrira, the Rebbe explained in today's Farbrengen several inyanim in the Rambam. One came in continuation to what the Rebbe discussed last week, B'negei the Menorah. The Rebbe tried to prove very strongly in last week's Farbrengen that the Menorah was not shaped round. And the figure that we have of the Menorah, we have right here in Shul that the candles of the Menorah go around, the Rebbe explained in last week's Farbrengen, is an error. Where did it originate, the Rebbe explained? It originates from the Titus Gate in Rome. And the Titus Gate in Rome, there's a Menorah carved out, and this is the shape of the Menorah on this gate. However, the Rebbe explained, based on the Rambam, that the Menorah was shaped vertical, like a shin, giving out the sticks, like the letters, the three vavim that compose a shin. In the very same way, all the 7 candles came out of the Menorah. This is how the Rebbe explained it at length in last week's Farbrengen. 6 and 1 middle one, right. And which gave a total of 7 Knei Menorah. And as the Rebbe added on in today's Farbrengen, it's very pashtusdik, very simple it would be to learn this way, because we constantly have the expression in Chumash and in Gemara, B'negei the Menorah, the expression goes Knei Menorah, sticks of Menorah. And how is a stick shaped? A stick usually is not shaped round, a stick usually is shaped straightforward. However, the Rebbe claims that there is an Even Ezra in Chumash, as well as a sefer called Maaseh Choshev. Now this Maaseh Choshev is a sefer which was edited by the Mishnas Chasidim. And the Tzemach Tzedek writes that he heard from the Alter Rebbe, from his grandfather, that everything which is written by the Mishnas Chasidim is extremely reliable and authentic, because he writes everything which he had b'Kabbalah from the Arizal. And in the sefer Maaseh Choshev, which was also written by the same person who wrote the Mishnas Chasidim, there he explains, al pi Kabbalah, why the shape of the candles of the Menorah wasn't a round way. The Rebbe says openly this is contradictory to what we explained last week. As well as an Even Ezra, which from this Even Ezra in Chumash, it also comes out to be that the Menorah was shaped round. The Rebbe explained today as follows. First of all, the Rebbe says that there is a Rambam, Iksav Yad HaRambam, manuscript from the Rambam, as well as a commentary on Torah from the Rambam's son, Rabbi Avram, the son of the Rambam, who both write that the Menorah was shaped in a vertical way, not round, but taka in a straight way, just like the letters coming, the vavs coming out of the shin, the 3 vavim that compose the shin, in the very same way the Menorah was erected in the Beis HaMikdash. And in general, how can we say that the Ma'aseh Choshev, who was so authentic, should write something which was not a reality? The Rebbe leaned to explain today as follows. And the Rebbe brought an Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch and Hilchas Pesach writes, B'negeya, selling of the chametz, the Alter Rebbe writes it, that as generations went by, in later generations, there were new manuscripts from Rishonim which were discovered, which this taka changes the opinion of Achronim. In other words, if we have something which the Magen Avraham or the Taz would paskin, or the Bach, the Rebbe says, and we know that the Alter Rebbe in his Shulchan Aruch constantly relies on the Magen Avraham and on the Taz. However, at the same token, if a manuscript would be discovered from a previous Rishon, which would be contradictory to what the Achronim paskin, then we would definitely have to take in consideration as well this new manuscript which was discovered. Obviously, the Rebbe says, we must say that when the Ma'aseh Choshev, the Mishnas Chassidim, wrote his Chibur, he did not have access to this manuscript of the commentary of the Rambam, as well as the writings of the Rambam's son, Rabbi Avraham. Memela, this led him to interpret that the menorah was shaped round. However, would he have had access, would he have known what the opinion of the Rambam was, as well as the Rambam's son who bases his opinion on his father, the Rambam, then probably he would have held different as well. But again, in today's Farbrengen, in other words, the Rebbe gave already in a Sinas Makom, the Rebbe is going naturally in the opinion that the menorah was shaped in a vertical way. But however, in today's Farbrengen as well, the Rebbe is also leaving room to learn that the menorah was shaped round. Like every union, the Rebbe says that in this case it seems more that we should rely on the Rambam and on his son. First of all, we have a drawing from the Rambam. In this Pirush there is a diagram from the Rambam himself, and the Rambam is a Pesach LaHalacha, to say that it was shaped in a straight way. The Rebbe said, what would be a nafkemina LaHalacha nowadays, how we learn which way the menorah was shaped? The Rebbe suggested an idea would be as follows. We know that we're not allowed to imitate the menorah of the Beis HaMikdash. This is a cloud. Today, if you'll notice, all shuls, all menorahs, we do not have menorahs of 7 candles. Why? Based on this halacha that we're not allowed to imitate, we're not allowed to copy the menorah as it was in the Beis HaMikdash. Now the question would be, if we were to follow the opinion that the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash was straight, not round, now the question arises, if one goes and makes a menorah, take 7 candles exactly as it was in the Beis HaMikdash. However, he will not make it round. We are learning that the Beis HaMikdash, it was round. He will make it straight, or vice versa, according to the others that hold that in the Beis HaMikdash it was round, and he will make it straight. Or according to the way the Rambam learns that in the Beis HaMikdash it was straight, and he will make it round. The question arises, is he over on this issur of not imitating the menorah as the menorah was in the Beis HaMikdash? When the Rambam begins the description how the menorah was shaped, the Rambam gives opening words. Ha-menorah mefureshes surasa b'Torah. That this is how the Rambam opens Perek Gimel of Hilchas Beis HaBchira. That the menorah, it's described exactly in Chumash what the menorah should look like. So the Rebbe asked last week as well as this week, today again, explained, why does the Rambam have to, every word in the Rambam is extremely accurate. Why does the Rambam have to add on these words? What difference is it lahalacha if the menorah is mefurish surasa b'Torah or not? The Rambam gives us an exact description what the menorah looks like. Prior to that, the Rambam gives a general introduction. You shall know that in the Torah it says exactly how to make the menorah. Why does the Rambam have to give this introduction before he describes exactly what the menorah looked like? So the Rebbe explained, we know there's an Indian of a Zokin Mamre. Zokin Mamre means if one goes and paskins against halacha and Torah. So the halacha is, if he is a Zokin Mamre, bedova hamefurish b'kor, on something which is beferish in a pasuk, he says, goes against, says in the pasuk so and so, and he says something which contradicts a pasuk, then the halachas of Zokin Mamre do not apply to this person. Why? Because this is something which is very obvious. Nobody's going to listen to him anyways, because we will not accept anyone's opinion against an open pasuk in the Torah. As the Gemara uses the expression, "B'davar shehatzdukim moedim boi." Something which the tzdukim also admit, those that only believe in Torah Shebiksav. And this, they admit to it. Why? Because it's an open pasuk in Torah Shebiksav. They agree to that as well. Then the concept of Zakum Mamre does not apply. My nafkemine. If one would be a Zakim Mamre in the Tziyur of the Menorah, being that the Rambam gives the introduction, HaMenorah mefuresha surasa b'Torah, being that the Tzuras HaMenorah is, Torah tells us, describes exactly how the Menorah is supposed to be made. So Memela, this puts Tziyur HaMenorah into the category of something that Zakum Mamre does not apply. And as the Rebbe went on in today's Farbrengen and said, "Meinaf kimine b'negei lahalacha," if Zakum Mamre does go on in this inyan or does not go on in this inyan, so the Rebbe brought an example that in Gemara Kedushin we find if one is mekadesh in Isha with all kind of various types of ways the Gemara describes. The Gemara describes if he's mekadesh in Isha, the idea of Kedushin is that the woman whom he's mekadesh is supposed to gain some sort of a satisfaction. Now this satisfaction could be any type of satisfaction, as long as to the woman it's considered satisfaction. She's satisfied with it. So if one is mekadesh as a isha, al menas that he was never a zakin mamre. This is what he's saying. He's her mekadesh, based on the condition that he was never a zakin mamre. So here we have an afkemine b'negei lahalacha. If menorah mefuresha surasa b'Torah, and though this person may have at one time denied tzuras ha-menorah, but being that menorah is mefuresha surasa b'Torah, the din of Zakum Mamre does not go on here. If menorah would not be mefuresha surasa b'Torah, it wouldn't be something which is mefurish b'Torah, then the dinim of Zakim Mamre would apply to this case. He would be considered a Zakim Mamre. Once he's considered a Zakim Mamre, and he's mekadesh es ha'isha al menas that he was never a Zakim Mamre, if he came out once with a wrong opinion on Menorah, he would be considered a Zakim Mamre. Today's Farbrengen, the Rebbe elaborated this whole inyan as well, and brought to our attention another inyan, that this whole description of Menorah, which we discussed last week, how everything was shaped in such a beautiful way, when does this apply? Only to a gold menorah. If the menorah would be made of any other type of substance, and al pi halacha, you were allowed to make menorah from metal or from other type of things. In fact, when the Yidden went back in the days of Chanukah, when the Yidden gained control again of the Beis HaMikdash, then we find that the Yidden were poor, especially they weren't able to afford to have a menorah shel zav, to have a gold menorah. So slowly, gradually, as they were able to afford, they made a more expensive menorah. So what do we see? That the menorah could be from other things as well. The Rambam, after describing exactly the menorah in 3 halachas, concludes later in halacha dalet, Bamed dvarim amurim b'sha'asu hazav. When does all the engraving apply to the menorah? When the menorah is made out of gold. However, if the menorah would be made from any other type of substance, then all the detailed engraving does not apply. So Memela, this is what the Rambam tells us. HaMenorah mefuresha surasa b'Torah, that the Torah tells us exactly how to make the menorah. This is negei lahalacha as well. It's not just a general introduction from the Rambam. Here the Rebbe is going a step further. Why is it negei lahalacha? Because the Torah's description, what the menorah is supposed to look like, only applies when the menorah is made out of gold. However, in the case when the menorah is made out of a different substance, then the seal which the Torah tells us how the menorah is supposed to be made does not apply. As the Rambam goes on to explain. After the Rambam gives a complete and exact description of the menorah, the Rambam tells us in Halacha Yud Aleph that right in front of the menorah there was like a little step. And the kohen who would light the menorah would have to go on this step. To be exact, the Rambam says there were shalosh mailos, 3 steps, she'aleha kohen oimed umeitiv es haneiros. The kohen would stand on these 3 steps, and that's where he would do the entire job of lighting the menorah. So the Rebbe brought to our attention, the Rambam describes the exact size of the menorah, the height of the menorah. The menorah, I think, was 18 tvachim high. All the details. It comes to the description of the steps of the small staircase, the mini staircase, which was right in front of the menorah. There the Rambam does not tell us the size. The Rambam is giving us such a detailed description of everything in the Beis HaMikdash. Why does he not explain as well what size were the steps in front of the menorah? So the Rebbe said the Rambam cannot do it. Why? This was there as a convenience to the Kohen. Because the Kohen didn't only light the menorah, it was a complete job. The Kohen had to make sure that the menorah is clean and clean it out, make sure that the candles are, the wicks are proper. There was a complete job of caring for the menorah. Not every Kohen was the same height. There were taller Kohenim and there were shorter Kohenim. So if a Kohen was shorter, he needed higher steps in front of the menorah so that he should be able to get up and do a perfect job on the menorah. If a Kohen was taller, he didn't need that high steps. So that's why the Rambam cannot give us a description to describe exactly how high or what size rather these steps were, because these steps Taka didn't have a set size. The size of these steps would vary accordingly to the height of the Kohen Gadol. If they would to the Kohen who was lighting the menorah at that time. As the Rambam in the beginning of the halachas tells us about the Beis HaMikdash, and as the Rebbe discussed last week, it's referred to as Beis HaPchira, because this is the spot which the Rebbe has selected that the Shechina should dwell on this area. And as we find that this is the Har HaMoriah, this is a spot which carries a tremendous kedusha within it. So the Rebbe asked, in today's Farbrengen, there is a very popular pasuk, a pasuk which we recite in davening daily, and this pasuk discusses about the spot of the Beis HaMikdash. We say in the Akedah daily that after Avram wanted to bring Yitzchak as a korban, he expressed himself, Vayikra Avram Shem HaMokem Ahu Hashem Yireh Asher Yomer Hayoim Bahar Hashem Yireh. So Avram Avinu already expressed the greatness of this place, and the Rambam does not make no mention to refer back that the kedusha of this place was already recognized by Avraham Avinu. Rabbi explained that in Kedusha we find various levels. There was a Mishkan. Between the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, between rather the time that the Yidden were in the Midbar and the Beis HaMikdash, the Rambam tells us that there were various Mishkans. The Yidden were in Noiv, in Givoin, and in Shiloi. One of the places, in fact, I think it's Shiloi, the Mishkan stood there for a period of 369 years, which is almost as long as the duration of one of the Beit HaMikdash. How long was the Beis HaMikdash? Not much longer. 400 years, the other one more than 400, but still, it's not much of a span between 369 and the years the Beis HaMikdash stood. However, the Kedusha on the spots that the Mishkan, any of the Mishkan stood, once the Mishkan was moved away from this spot and carried over to another spot, the previous spot had no Kedusha. Just like we find in the Torah, there's an Indian by Soite, V'lokhu ma'afar ha-Mishkan, they would take from the dirt, from the dust, which was around the Mishkan. So we see that not only was the Mishkan Kodesh, but the dust, the area which the Mishkan dwelled on, also carried a Kedusha. However, once the Mishkan was moved to a different place, we do not say that we'll go back to the Midbar, and we'll discover the areas where the Mishkan stood in the Midbar, and we'll say that there's a Kedusha there. There's no such Tzavara. However, by the Beis HaMikdash, it is completely different. A concept of Shechina came to the Beis HaMikdash, which remained on this spot of the Mikdash eternally. So we see that the Beis HaMikdash introduced something completely new. When we're talking about a selected spot, the Rebbe says, there are various ways to learn it. We could select one spot, but at the same time, not exclude other spots. We could select this spot and say, no, it's this spot and not anywhere else. The Rambam uses the expression, Kivon shenivna hamikdash b'Yerushalayim, as the Beis HaMikdash was built, Nesru kola mekoyimois kulon livnois behem bayis lashem. We are not allowed to go ahead and build at any other site a house, a bayis lashem. Now the question arises, what's about a bama? Now in the times of Beis HaMikdash, there was a popular concept of a bama. A bama simply would mean a mizbeach. Didn't call for any erection of any type of a house. There was no other construction coming with it. It was only a mizbeach, an altar. What do we see from the Rambam here? That the shit of the Rambam would be that kiver shenivna hamikdash b'Yerushalayim, there was an issa to build a bayis l'Hashem. However, to be makre v'korban a bama elsewhere other than the spot of the Beis HaMikdash, the Rambam would hold that it wasn't prohibited. To build a house l'Hashem elsewhere, this is something, once the Beis HaMikdash was built, cannot be done anywhere else. So Mamela the Rebbe explains as follows. From the pasuk of Avram Avinu, Hashem yireh, Anshe Yomer, Hayoim, Bahar Hashem Yeroeh, this only tells us that this is a very great spot. But to say this spot and not any other spot, this we don't see from this pasuk. Mamela, that is why the Rambam has to come out and explain it befeirish, that Kivan Shenivna Hamikdash, a bayis l'Hashem, cannot be built at any other spot. The Rebbe concluded this shmuas. Here we see a tremendous inyan. The Gemara tells us that when Mashiach will come, all the Batei Knesiyos, the Beis HaMikdash Ma'atz, the mini Beis HaMikdashim that are with Yidden and Golas, will all be transferred into Eretz Yisrael. So it's something tremendous. So from this we see that the Kedusha, the holiness that's in a shul, is stronger than the holiness that was in the Mishkan, the Rebbe says. Because in the Mishkan, we just explained, once the Mishkan left that area did not remain holy in any way. Here we say that the entire construction of a shul, which is composed of the dust that the shul is standing on, not only the shul, the men's shul, the Rebbe had on, but even the Ezras Nashim, the women's section of the shul as well, will also be going along. Once Mashiach comes, all of this will be carried over to Yerushalayim, to the Har HaBayis. And this shows us the great Kedusha that is within a shul. The Rebbe said it's most appropriate at the same time to mention about the great Kedusha which is at the shul here, meaning 770, which is a place where the Frierdiker Rebbe lived in for 10 years. And out of this house, the Frierdiker Rebbe gave leadership to his Hasidim for 10 years, for a period of 10 years. The Rebbe says that this is a house where it's most appropriate to make proper decisions, as far as and serious decisions, when they're made with a pnimius, as far as all in Yonam B'Negeya Torah mitzvahs, and to see to it later that all these decisions that are made at this holy spot of 770 will be brought down into a reality. B'Negeya, the Zohar, which the Rebbe learned in today's Sedra, as well as the Mishnah and Pirkei Avos, the Rebbe combined both in Yonim, as we will see in a minute. There is no commentary from the Rebbe's father on the Zohar of Devarim. So the Rebbe said it would be most appropriate to learn an inyan in Masechta Midas, which also deals with the Beis HaMikdash. And there is commentary from the Rebbe's father on Masechta Midas, whereby he refers to a Gemara. Rabbi Lezer in Midas. Rabbi Lezer ben Yankov said he forgot what a certain area in Beis HaMikdash was utilized for. So the Gemara continues, Abishol, who was a Tana by the name of Abishol, responded, Sham hayu noisnin yayin v'shemen. That was the area in the Beis HaMikdash where the wine and the oil was stored. What was the name of that area? Beis Shmanim. It carried the name, the House of Oils. And the emes is Rebbe tied it in that it also has a shaykhis to this week's Sedra. What shaykh? How could we have a shaykh? How does it have a shaykhis to this week's Sedra? Excuse me. At the very end of Parshas Devarim, Pasuk talks about Yoir ben Menashe lokach es kol chevel Argoiv. Yoir, the son of Menashe, took an area in Ever HaYarden which is described as Argoiv. There's a Mishnah Menachos. Mishnah Menachos tells us that Regev was an area where a lot of oil came from for the use of the Beis HaMikdash. And as the Rebbe explained, we find many areas in Chumash where we can use the same word with an aleph or without an aleph. So though here the pasuk here refers to it as Argoiv, when the Mishnah uses the expression Regev, it's still the same territory, the same area. So the Rebbe's father is learning Pshat. What's the Pshat in the pasuk? Yoir ben Menashe took Chevel Argoiv. Argoiv produced oil. Oil was used for the lighting of the menorah. That's why this is suitable to the word Yoir. Yoir also meaning light, illumination. So that is why Yoir took Chevel Argoiv, because Chevel Argoiv also brought Lichtigkeit, because the Beis HaMikdash, the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash was lit with this oil which came from Regev. What did Abba Shaul do? What do we see from Abba Shaul? Shows us a tremendous inyan, the Rebbe says. There was a Tana by the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yankov. He forgot what a certain area in the Beis HaMikdash served the purpose. So one may say, if a great person forgets something, it's not suitable for me to go ahead and remind him. I'm much smaller than him. My knowledge in Torah is much less than him. So why should I go and remind? So here we have a lesson from Abba Shaul. Abba Shaul said no. If he saw that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yankov forgot an inyan, he did not hold himself back in any way, but on the contrary, came and brought back education to say what this area in the Beis HaMikdash served for. And as we see, the Rebbe said, in that area they kept wine, in that area they kept oil. What is the difference between wine and oil? Wine, when a person drinks wine, it brings him to simcha. Brings him to, in other words, the idea of wine represents loudness. Because wine, yain is misameach halakim v'anosh. What does shemen stand for? The contrary. Shemen is always low. In other words, shemen does not bring about any type of a noise. Shemen brings light. Shemen brings lichtigkeit. This very same area, which housed oil as well as wine, why did Abba Shaul say that the name of the area is Beis Shmanim? He didn't say that the name is Beis Yayin or Beis Yayin v'Shemen. This the Rebbe explained the delicacy, how we are supposed to act when we remind somebody something. When somebody has forgotten something, and we go ahead and we remind them something, it has to be with the highest way of modesty possible. To such an extent that there's a Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara tells us that it came when Shabbos fell out on Erev Pesach. In the time of Bnei Beseira, they forgot how to act with the Korban Pesach. So Gemara tells us that Hillel was the one that reminded the Yidden and told them exactly what has to be done. Hillel is noted for his modesty. Hillel was one of the greatest Anovim. Anova, we always refer to Hillel. Still, at the same time, the Gemara concludes that later, after Hillel reminded all the halachas how we're supposed to act on an Erev Pesach, it came to some final points in the halacha how we are supposed to treat the knife that we shech the Korban Pesach with. Hillel forgot. Why did he forget it? Because it seems that somehow he had some, and we're talking about a person like Hillel who was full of another, but at the same time he had some sort of a feeling within him, some sort of a feeling of satisfaction that he was the one that reminded in Yonim which other people forgot. And this shows us that the attitude of Abba Shaul, though he found the Tana of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yankov that forgot an inyan, So on one side, when we see somebody forgetting an Indian and Torah, we should never play modest and not go ahead and remind him. But on the other hand, we have to know how to do it. It has to be done with the highest level of delicacy, not to embarrass anyone, not to make anybody feel bad. And this is why Abishol brought out the idea of Lishkas Beis Shmanim, the idea of oil. Oil meaning for the spiritual idea of oil. Spiritual idea of oil standing for bringing spiritual illumination. Because this is what Abishol wanted to do by reminding Rab Lezer ben Yankiv on the Indian that he forgot. Once we are talking about Abishol, who is a great Tana, it's most appropriate that the Mishnah in Avos, which we'll learn in today, which was learned in today's Farbrengen in the second Perek, should also deal with Abishol. Perek of Pirkei Avos, Mishnah Tes. Mishnah begins. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 Talmidim, 5 disciples. The Mishnah tells us who they are. Then the Mishnah says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would say the greatness, how each and every, in what area each and every Tana excelled. And then he concludes, Hu ha'ya'ima, who is the who? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. If we were to put all the Chachmei Yisrael on a scale, and Eliezer ben Hulkanis and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hulkanis on the other side of the scale, the greatness of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hulkanis would weigh over the greatness of all the Chachmei Yisrael. This was the opinion of whom? Of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Abishol loimer. This Abishol who we're just talking about. Abishol says different. If all Chachmei Yisrael would be on one side of the scale, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hulkanis in Mohem will also be with them, still Rabbi Eliezer ben Aroch would be the one that would weigh over all the Chol Chachmei Yisrael. So, Abishol found Rabbi Eliezer ben Aroch to be the most outstanding in all the disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. If we look into the Mishnah, what was the great qualification of Rabbi Eliezer ben Aroch? Kimayon hamisgaber. His learning Torah, he was strengthening himself like a well. Just like a well keeps on constantly flowing, he was constantly flowing with Torah. It's a very popular Gemara, where the Gemara describes 2 approaches in learning. It's at the end of Masechta Horayos. There the Gemara tells us that there is one approach of a Sinai, meaning a person, it's like Har Sinai. He knows everything. He has a clearness in everything. There is another approach. There's an approach of an Oiker Horim. He rips mountains. What's the pshat? He rips mountains. He's very sharp in learning. He's a big charif. If we just learned, when we're learning the Zohar, we were learning about the greatness of Abishol. What did Abishol do? Abishol reminded Rabbi Eliezer ben Yankiv an Indian that he forgot. What does this show? What is Abishol's derech in learning? If a question arises between Sinai and Oiker Horim, he's definitely a Sinai. Abishol. He believes that we should have knowledge all over. And that's why where he saw an Indian was forgotten, he came along and reminded. If so, Abishol should stress the greatness of a person who is a Sinai. And if we have here 2 Tanoim, one being described as a boyer sud she'en eina mi'abed tipa, a solid that does not lose a drop, or somebody who gains strength like a well that keeps on strengthening itself. Which is Sinai and which is Haikaharim? Naturally, boyer sud she'en eina mi'abed tipa, this is a Sinai, a person who knows and refers to everything, has a clearness in everything. Mayan HaMizgaber reflects the idea of one being an Oiker Horim. So listen carefully. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tells us the greatness of a Sinai. Abishol, whom we just learned in Masechta Midas, his derech of learning is when he sees somebody forgetting something, he goes ahead and reminds him. So that means that Abishol is a Sinai. It comes to praise the Talmidim of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He doesn't praise the Sinai, but he praises the Oiker Horim. Oiker Horim rips mountains. Once sharp and pilpul in learning, the terminology of Oiker Horim is used. That's one general question on the Mishnah. Then the Rebbe asks a few more questions. If we look into the sequence of the Mishnah, we had Hillel v'Shammai, then we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was Mekabel from Hillel v'Shammai. He was a disciple of Hillel v'Shammai. Afterwards, comes to Mishnah test, the Mishnah uses a different expression. Chamisha talmidim hoyu lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Ve'eluhen. Until now, we were always using an expression, one kibel from another. Now this expression of kibel stopped, and the Mishnah starts with a new expression. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 talmidim. First of all, the Rebbe asks, we find elsewhere in Chazal that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai didn't have 5, he had 80. What are we going to do with that? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 80 talmidim. Here the Mishnah tells us he only had 5. Furthermore, Abishol oimer mishmoi. Abishol says in his name, in whose name? In the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Obviously, Abishol also hanged around there, so he was also a disciple. Why isn't he mentioned? Mishnah tells us 5 great giants who were students, disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And what happens later with Abishol? Why isn't he considered the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? Anyways, the Mishnah requires a lot of clarification. The Rebbe learns as follows. Chamisha talmidim hoyu lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 different categories of disciples. He didn't have only 5 disciples. Naturally, he had much more. However, if we are to look into the various types of Talmidim that congregated around Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, they will fit into 5 different groups. One was led by Rabbi Elazar ben Hukanis, who excelled, was like a Sinai type of a group. Then there was another group who you were able to define Ashrei Yeladatoi. A third group which was able to be defined as Chosid. A fourth group as Yerei Chet, sin-fearing, and Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, strengthening as a well that keeps on constantly strengthening itself. Which means 5 general groups were sitting around Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Here the Rebbe goes on, there's a Sefri that tells us, in the end of Pashas V'zei Sabracha, that just like Moshe Rabbeinu lived for 120 years, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai also lived for 120 years. And there are many similarities between Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the first 40 years of his age, he learned for himself Torah. Second 40 years of his age, he taught others. The third 40 years, Pirnas es Yisrael. He was in charge of Klal Yisrael. He was the Nasi. He was the leader of Klal Yisrael. So the Mishnah tells us here, Chamisha Talmidim hoyu lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's groups of Talmidim were broken up into 5. Coincides with the idea of Chamisha Chumshei Torah. Just like by Moshe Rabbeinu, there's an Indian of Chamisha Chumshei Torah, by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai as well. What are the definitions of these Talmidim? Let us look into the Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar ben Hukanis was a Boyer Sut She'eina Ma'abed Tipa. He was a Sinai. He remembered everything. Everything you learned, you remembered. In other words, this was one category of students. This Rabbi Elazar ben Hukanis is referred to in Gemara as Rabbi Elazar HaGadol, Rabbi Elazar the Great. There's a pasuk somewhere. The Hagdullah, so the Gemara says, the Hagdullah zu ma'aseh bereishis. So this already shows us that the Talmud of Rabbi Elazar ben Hukanis has a shaychus to Chumash Bereishis. Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya, Ashrei Yeladatoi. When it comes to say the greatness of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya, he says, Ashrei Yeladatoi, he praises the birth of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya. Which Chumash talks about births? That's the beginning of Chumash Shemos. Sect of disciples that was around Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Yossi HaKoyen. Toiras Koyanim. Chumash Vayikra has another name. What's another name for Chumash Vayikra? Toiras Koyanim. As the Rebbe is learning here the Mishnah, the Rebbe goes to Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch and wants to explain Chumash Devarim and did not explain Bamidbar. And he says, the Rebbe says with a smile, if we could explain all Chumashim, In other words, if we found something for Bereshis, Shmois, and Vayikra, and we will find Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch having a shaychus to Devarim, so obviously we could already learn Glatik that Rab Shimon ben Nesanel, with the definition of Yerei Chait, has a shaychus to Chumash Bamidbar. But the Rebbe says there's more than that, much more than that. Rab Shimon ben Nesanel tells us Yerei Chait was fearing of a sin. What's the pshat? He feared a sin. It doesn't say Yerei Shamayim. It doesn't say Yerei Hashem. He feared to do a sin. Not that he feared to do a sin because of the consequences that a sin brings with it. Because he was afraid of the oynish that he will get or something like it. He merely feared to do a sin because of the fact he did not want to have a shaychus to Aveira. Chassidus teaches chait not only meaning sin, chait means meloshen chisorin. One will be lacking something, one will be missing something if he sins. Chumash Bamidbar has another name, the Chumash Hapkudim, the Chumash of counting. Because the Yidden were counted in Chumash Bamidbar. Reb Shimon ben Nesanel was a Yerei Chait. In other words, he feared sin. So he was always counting the Rabbalons. There's a pasuk, Vavram Zokim Baba Yomim. Avram got old and he came with his days. What's the pshat? He came with his days. So Chassidus teaches Avram had loaded days. Every single day was utilized. Yomim Yitzaru, every day. The Rebbe gives a person X amount of years, and every day has to be calculated for. The Rebbe says a person cannot say that he will do today his share for today and for tomorrow. It is not so. It's impossible. Whatever he accomplishes today is for today. And automatically there's a tomorrow, you have to accomplish tomorrow something new. So the idea of Rab Shimon ben Nesanel was counting. So the Rebbe explained, you meet a Yid, you come in contact with a Yid, you start counting. What do you count? You tell him that there are 613 mitzvahs. If it's impossible to tell a person at once about 613, so you tell him about some. The Rebbe says you tell him about tefillin. You ask him, is he wearing tzitzis? You tell him about the 10 miftzayim. You see to it if he has a letter of Sefer Torah. And ultimately, you count with the person. This is the idea of Chumash Pekudim. You count with him until you bring him to a count of 613. When does one have this realization of Chumash Pekudim? When he's in the position of Yerei Chait. He's sin-fearing. In other words, not only does he not do an Aveira, because the Aveira will bring inconvenient consequences, or he's afraid of the punishment which will come about from the Aveira. More than that, he's afraid he doesn't want to be lacking any inyan. And he knows that by doing an Aveira, he will be lacking something. It will lead him to Chazarah, to be missing out. And he doesn't want that. Then we come to Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, Kemayan HaMizgaber. Mara tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who said Chumash Devarim is Mishnah Torah. Moshe said it out of his own. But it doesn't mean Chas v'Sholom Moshe said something new which Moshe introduced and has no base on Torah. Where did Moshe know to say Chumash Devarim? He knew it from the previous 4 Chumashim. In other words, Moshe had such a great and vast knowledge in Torah until then that he was able to go ahead and say Mishnah Torah on his own. What does this reflect? This reflects the idea of a Mayan HaMizgaber. One strengthening himself so like a well that constantly flows. This was Moshe's position in Torah. So here we see that these 5 groups of Talmidim that were around by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, this is exactly according to the 5 Chumash. Now the question arises about Abishol. Why does Abishol claim that the Maila is in Oiker Horim? Because we know that Rabbi Shol himself reflected the idea of a Sinai. So this the Rebbe explained that there's Chassidus Taiches, very famous pasuk, Lech Lecha Ma'artzecha Me'meladetecha Ve'beis Avicha. What's the pshat? So Chassidus Taiches, Ma'artzecha means your artzius, your habits. A person, Torah tells a person is supposed to get out of his habits. In other words, if he has his routine, his own habits, get out of that. Basically meaning, when one is in one position, that is when he's supposed to really appreciate the contrast, the opposite as well. Rabbi used the pasuk, Kemayim Kara al Nefesh Ayefa. There's a pasuk, just like cold water on a very tired person. Abishol was taken on the level of a Sinai. And his derech and learning was Sinai. So being that he was a Sinai, he was lacking the derech halimud of an oikaharim. He wasn't in that position, as we just learned. That is why when Abishol wanted to bring out the greatness of the real outstanding one of the 5 types of Talmidim Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had, Abishol brought out a Maila which he himself didn't have. He brought out the Maila of the Oiker Harim, of one being a Charif, one being sharp, as opposed to the Maila of being Sinai. So that is why Abishol says, the Rebbe stresses, Abishol Oimer. So Chassidus always teaches, Oimer means not only did he once say it, he constantly said it. It was an often saying of his. Abishol would often say, still Rabbi Lezer ben Aroch bekaf shniyas machiyas kulam. Why? Because he himself, being that he was lacking this inyan of charifus, of sharpness and learning, of oiker harem. That is why he was the one that was really able to appreciate it, and that's why he really praised this derech of Rabbi Lezer ben Aroch. The Rebbe also learned a Rashi in this week's Sedre, and the pasuk in Devarim which the Rebbe chose to learn is the 8th. In Chumash Devarim, the Rebbe learned pasuk Ches, the 8th pasuk. The Rebbe gave a reason why is he learning pasuk Ches, because Ches is a number that deals with Geula, and these days are appropriate to talk about Geula. So the Rebbe, and even in Shmona Esrei we find that the 8th bracha in Shmona Esrei, that is the bracha where we ask for Geula. And the truth is that this pasuk Ches here in Chumash Devarim, is also a pasuk that deals with Geula. What does the pasuk say? Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to the Yidden, and he's telling them, Re'ei nasati lefneichem es haaretz, I've given you the land. Boyu u'reshu es haaretz, come and inherit it. Asher nishba Hashem la'veseichem, the land that the Rebishter has sworn to your ancestors, la'Avram, li'Yitzchak, li'Yankev, losis lahem u'lazara machareim, to give to them and to their children after them. Now the Rebbe raised many questions in this Rashi on pasuk Ches. To go over very briefly, it's getting very late. Rashi says, Re'ei nasati, beinechem atem royim, you're seeing it with your own eyes. Eini oimer lechem me'umid u'mishmua, I'm not giving you any type of estimation, I'm not giving you anything that I've heard. Boyu u'reshu, ein ma'arer bedover, there is no one that is arguing this. Ve'einchem tzrichem le'melchama. So as the Rebbe explained, there are 2 levels. At times, they can be involved in a war. So Rashi says, Einchem tzrichem l'milchama. Furthermore, ein ma'arer bedover, there is no one that is disputing it. In other words, at times there could be some that would dispute it, the fact that you're getting Eretz Yisrael. They will not go into war with you, but they will just dispute it. So Rashi says, neither of these inyanim, Moshe says, will be. Ve'einchem tzrichem l'milchama. And then he goes ahead. Ilu lo yisholchu meraglim, lo hayu tzrichem l'klei zayin. If they wouldn't have sent meraglim, they wouldn't have needed ammunition even. In other words, if the Yidden wouldn't have sent meraglim, they could have walked into Eretz Yisrael and just take over Eretz Yisrael. What's the pshat? Klei zayin. At times, you are not in war, but you have to scare the people. So how do you get the people scared? By showing ammunition. So Rashi says, if you wouldn't have sent the meraglim, you wouldn't even have to show them ammunition. Not only you wouldn't have to go to war with them, you wouldn't even have to scare them. They would just, they would just tippel aleim and masav afachat. A fear would fall upon them and they will all leave. The Rebbe says, it's a very strange expression, this Rashi. We know that every word in Rashi is accurate. Tell me, what kind of sin was sending the meraglim? We know, Rashi taught us in Pasha Shlach, that when the Meraglim left Eretz Yisrael, left the Midbar rather, they were ehrliche Yidden, they were fine Yidden. Moshe himself was in favor of sending Meraglim. So Rashi says, if not for sending the Meraglim, they wouldn't even have needed ammunition. If Rashi would have told us, if not for the sin of the Meraglim, that the Meraglim came back and they instigated all of Klal Yisrael not to want to go to Eretz Yisrael, I could understand. Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi says, if not for the sending of the Meraglim, they even wouldn't have needed ammunition to show. What's the pshat in this Rashi? In the Sifri, the Rebbe says, there are a few more words. Sifri says they wouldn't have sent Meraglim, but he uses, I don't recall, he uses some sort of Aramaic word, a long word, which the Rebbe interpreted as meaning they could have sent 2 people. Why 2 people would be permissible to send? Simply because the Yidden had to know how to divide Eretz Yisrael, where there are mountains and where are there valleys, as we read previously in Chumash, how Eretz Yisrael was divided to all the Shvatim. So if they would have sent in 2 people, and these 2 people, not as Meraglim, just to look around and see geographically what Eretz Yisrael looks like, and bring back this information to the Yidden, to Moshe Rabbeinu and the Yidden, this would have been okay. However, more than that, they shouldn't have done. The Rebbe learns Pshat as follows. What's the Pshat the Yidden sent Meraglim? Actually, we say there was nothing wrong by sending Meraglim, right? And the Meraglim were fine people, they were Ksherim Hayu B'Yis Hashem. However, the mere fact of sending Meraglim, this shows that the Yidden did not rely on the Rebishter. It shows that they wanted to go b'derech hateva. Because if the Yidden would rely totally on the Rebishter, after seeing all these great miracles from the Rebishter has taken them out of Mitzrayim or whatever they were ready zeicha to see from Hashem, the Yidden should have had fullest betach on the Rebishter and shouldn't have cared, ki who's there, what's going on in Eretz Yisrael. Whether the people are strong, whether the people are not strong, what do you care? You're going with the Rebishter. The Rebishter is with you, and the Rebishter is powerful, so Mamela, the Rebishter will solve all your problems. The moment the Yidden came to a decision that they are sending Meraglim, this means that the Yidden went into a different attitude. It means the Yidden went into an attitude of going derech hateva. And this is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu resented. And that is why Rashi says, Ilu lo sholchu meraglim, if they wouldn't have sent the Meraglim were fine Yidden, nothing wrong. But the fact was, by sending the Meraglim, they expressed an idea of going b'derech hateva and not relying on the Rebishter. And if they wouldn't have sent the Meraglim, they wouldn't have even have to come on to use ammunition to drive the Goyim out of Eretz Yisrael. Towards the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also mentioned, this is what we've spoken about in previous years, that again, that during the 9 days, as mentioned previously in the Farbrengen, the learning of inyanim that have a shaychus to Beis HaMikdash, Beis HaPchira, as well as also making siyumim, finishing Masechtas each days of the 9 days. And on the day of Tisha B'Av itself, also to make a siyum, but on the day of Tisha B'Av and an inyan that's permissible to learn on Tisha B'Av. And the Rebbe says, hopefully, through these siyumim, which we are making, a Masechtas in these 9 days, siyum meaning a conclusion, this will lead to a siyum on the Golas. We'll make an end on the Golas, and the Rebbe says, should Mashiach come before Tisha B'Av, then on Tisha B'Av we will have a real big siyum, not only on a Masechta, but a siyum on entire Shas, and on all parts of Torah. Says it's also appropriate, Rebbe mentioned today, about the siyum of the Sefer Torah, third Sefer Torah written by Temchet Mimim, which will be taking place on 15 days in Av next week, Mitzvah Hashem. The Rebbe said that to call out about the siyum, and as well the Rebbe said that recently it came to him a maimer which the Tzemach Tzedek said on a siyum Sefer Torah in the year Tafresh Chaf Aleph. The Rebbe says that it's written on the Maimah that it was celebrated very joyously, a siyum HaSefer in the city of Lubavitch, and Reb Chaim Avram, who was a son of the Tzemach Tzedek, a son of the Alter Rebbe, and an uncle to the Tzemach Tzedek, also participated in this siyum HaSefer, and at that siyum HaSefer, the Tzemach Tzedek said a short Maimah. The Rebbe says that this Maimah got to him recently from Russia. It's also an idea of Pidyon Shvuyim. Just like there's Pidyon Shvuyim Begashmi is to take out a person, there's a Pidyon Shvuyim Beruchni is on Divrei Torah. There's Divrei Torah Mamorim which were in Russia. There was nobody looking into them, and now the Mamorim came here, and they were also redeemed. It's a spiritual type of redemption for the Maimah. The Rebbe says that is why he suggests that this Maimah will be published it's more than proper that this Maimah should be published and printed for the occasion of the Siyum HaSefer, because this is also a Maimah which was said at a Siyum of a Sefer Torah by the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek in the year of Tafresh Chaf Aleph.